Today on SME OnPoint, we run a masterclass on how to get into the supply business and succeed at it. One of the easiest ways for some people to get into entrepreneurship is by supplying to government and other big businesses. Our masterclass leader is Lerato Sebata, and she shares some valuable insight on getting into this business and remaining afloat. Portia Mahane edited the following insert. Lerato Sebata founded Procurement with Lerato out of love for the profession and years of experience. She says there are misconceptions around the procurement industry.
The misconceptions about procurement is that, firstly, everything is a tender. Not everything else runs through a tender process. That's the first one. And then secondly, it's also if there's brown envelopes all over. You know, it's a corrupt environment. People are not ethical. Those are just false misconceptions. I mean, you're not oblivious to the fact that those things happen, but that's just one of the misconceptions, you know. And another thing is, it's just the paperwork. Procurement is not just paperwork and administration, you know. You go to school, you get qualified to be a procurement officer.
Supplying goods and services is one of the ways that some people start their entrepreneurial journey. Sebata says there's the correct way of getting into this industry that she says will ensure success. She shares important advice if this is your preferred route for business.
The first things first, as an entrepreneur, you must have your company registered. Okay? It's as basic as that. You must get your company registered with CIPC. You must get your profile right. You must write a business profile so that when you submit that to a procurement officer, you know what is it that you're offering. And another thing is make sure your compliance documents are in place. Compliance, I mean your BEE certificate, your tax clearance, your VAT if you are going to be a VAT paying supplier, right? So you have to get those compliance documents right. And this is where some of them get it wrong. To do your due diligence, even as an entrepreneur, if you want to tender, due diligence is quite important in essence that if you receive an email now from Liabo at SABC, right, .coza, that might not be Liabo from SABC, could be some syndicate happening, fraudulent. And then you just get an email from nowhere, you phone now those people, they organize and say, okay, yes, we do actually provide this at this place, and you're of the opinion that you're calling a supplier, right? And that's not. Then you start paying money into fraudulent, you know, which you're not even aware, and then you're defrauded. The other important thing is when you receive the tender document, you must read it. Entrepreneurs don't read tender documents. They just go right into what must I supply, and they forget about a lot of things that's required. And when you read the tender document, you understand the requirements. That helps you also understand what is this evaluation criteria that's needed for you to qualify. What they shouldn't do, I think the important thing is to be a master of all, like I said, and not focus on anything, because then you're not really building a proper portfolio, a brand for yourself. If you were successful in maybe 2-3 tenders that you got yourself into, and you use that very same money that you were paid to render a service, you use it for personal use, to pay rent, to pay electricity loosely without understanding how to manage your books. That does affect your portfolio, because as procurement we look into your financial statements. So if your financial statements are not in order, obviously you're not going to be one of the preferred suppliers. So you must manage your funds correctly so that you are also running a sustainable business.
Sebata points out that tenders and bidding is competitive, and one should be careful of pricing themselves out of the market.
Price is very important. If you are then going to supply us with a service or a product, you don't just price at the top of your head. You must understand the cost drivers of that which you're providing and what are your margins. Some people lose it on the pricing because they don't provide the profit margin that are, you know, sufficient or that is really reasonable. Some people will put 30% markup to something that needed only 15% markup. Then you're off the ballpark. So you have to make sure that you price correctly.
Liabo Setho, SABC News, Johannesburg. Thank you so much to Lerato for sharing that masterclass with us. You can be able to access this on our social media page. Our Instagram and Facebook handles are at SME OnPoint, and we also will be loading this slot on our YouTube page, the SABC News YouTube page. On to this now, the biggest setback to SMEs in South Africa and in the African continent is usually the access to credit, and SME ratings can be seen as the potential gateway to alleviate this issue. So according to credit rating analytics, countries such as India have SME rating schemes in place in which the government subsidizes SMEs. These ratings are recognized by the banks, and SMEs are then given credit pre-approvals based on the ratings. And as still Credit Analytics says, if South Africa considered this option, it would go a long way in improving the access to credit of SMEs in the country. Saveshen Pillay is the Managing Director at Credit Rating Analytics, and he joins me via Zoom. Saveshen, always a great pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for joining us on SME OnPoint. Tell me about the importance of credit ratings. We know that the sovereign and big companies, they get credit rated and they pay, in fact, to do that. How viable is it for SMEs who are really trying to get into the game to want to get credit rated? Is it even necessary?
Yes, Liabo. So thank you so much for having me on. I mean, look, the SME rating concept is a bit unfamiliar to the South African market. As you've correctly pointed out, it's quite prevalent in jurisdictions such as Asia and India. But it's still a fairly new concept to South Africa. So to answer your question in terms of its importance, I would say that, look, it actually is quite important. There is a huge information asymmetry between borrowers and lenders, meaning that SME businesses, in terms of the actual information that the banks have regarding their particular businesses, it's a bit limited. It's limited in scope, and it's difficult from a bank perspective to properly articulate or to get a good sense, a good idea of the business, where it sits from an economic perspective, the management structure, the management capabilities, the operational capabilities, the IT infrastructure within those businesses, which is all obviously quite important. In terms of your existing bank scoring models, it's very backward looking, and it doesn't really provide you with a good sense of where this business actually is, and what's the probability of repayment from this business. So your SME credit rating, if it is incorporated in South Africa, would obviously decrease that information asymmetry, and obviously improve the chances of access to credit for SMEs in the country.
Yeah. If we were to take this route, right, who would we need to approach? I know that as Credit Rating Analytics, you may have been having conversations with the World Bank around this. Would we need to include other policymakers in it to make it something that's easily identifiable for lenders to recognize it?
Yeah, so at the moment we're actually conducting a project on behalf of the World Bank Group, which looks into the SME industry within all countries that it's worked, and to try and create a framework that can then be adopted in a country like South Africa. But it's a sort of like a credit rating ecosystem that you need to set up. That credit rating ecosystem involves various stakeholders. So, for example, you need to get your regulators of credit ratings on board. You need to get your banks on board. You need to get your ministries linked to the SME industry on board. And you actually have to get the credit rating agencies themselves on board. So, for example, in Africa, we've got, there's about 18 rating agencies operating on the continent. You might be more familiar with the big three, but there obviously is 15 others. Now, from those 18, there's just 2 that specializes in SME ratings. In South Africa, unfortunately, we don't have a credit rating agency that specializes in SME ratings and SME sector in particular. So you would need to get a buy-in from a broad range of stakeholders. The SME rating industry traditionally is not the easiest business line item from a rating agency perspective to get off the line. Your clients are a bit inconsistent. Your revenue stream is slightly less. And places where it's worked quite well, you've obviously had government incentives whereby your actual SME businesses were provided with grants that they could then use to obtain these credit ratings. So from South Africa's perspective, it will need to be a multiple stakeholder approach to getting this concept off the ground, which I do think would obviously add tremendous value to SMEs within South Africa.
Yeah. Let's talk about precedents in India. They're already doing, the government is helping them by providing, I believe it's 75% of the cost value. What has been the outcome? Is it working in the favor of SMEs in India from your research that you've been conducting, Saveshen?
Yeah, so Liabo, so we're actually in the process of the actual project, but the preliminary research and prior research that we've done has pointed to the fact that it's actually been really successful in India. And I mean, so for example, one of the key reasons why it has been successful is not just the government subsidy, but the fact that your ratings are incorporated into the bank scoring models. So this was a buy-in from the Banking Association of India, where all banks would incorporate these ratings. It's a standardized rating scale, similar to how you get your investment grade, non-investment grade on the solvent side. So this standardized rating scale is incorporated into your bank scoring models. So if you're a business, an SME in India, you want to raise capital, maybe for an overdraft facility, for a medium-term loan, you would approach the rating agency first. 75% of your fee to get this rating would have already been paid by the government. You would then get a rating, and that rating would then be, you could then use that when you approach your banks to obtain your credit facilities. Now, one of the reasons why it's worked really well in India is that apart from the credit opinion, is an advisory component that's linked to the rating. Now, the advisory component would tell you that, look, if you approach the rating agency and you've got a bad credit rating, it would provide you with advice on how to improve that rating, so that when you do reapproach the rating agency, say in 6 months' time, you would have you would be in a much better credit standing if you took the advice initially. And so it not just provides you with an opinion, but it provides you with
tools and advice, like you say.
That's correct. That's correct.
All right.
So, yeah.
That's great. Saveshen Pillay, I'm afraid that's all we have time for, but thank you so much for sharing this insight with us. It's something that really piques my interest, and we will be looking into it in more detail. Thank you so much for being with us here on SME On Point. Well, that's all from SME On Point for this week.